Hagakure Show, and today I'm very happy because I'm here with Lindie. And if you don't know her, you should. So, Lindie, welcome to the show, and thank you for being
Thank,
here.
thanks so much for having me.
Could you talk about yourself a little bit first, for those who doesn't know you yet?
Hmm. So I am currently working as a designer in Singapore. I moved here in February. And apart from doing design on this side, I make videos on YouTube about language learning. And I also run a blog where I post about language learning techniques.
Great. But I believe that you're not a common language learning, and I'm saying that because let's start. How many languages have you studied during your life?
Quite a few. So the number of languages I've studied and the number of languages I can converse in are vastly different. So there's a big difference between just dabbling and trying to study a language and actually pursuing it to become conversational or fluent. So it's probably an uncountable number of how many languages I've tried or dabbled in or touched or studied the big basics of. But yeah, the amount of languages I'm conversational in is a bit less.
I see. And you have a kind of a preference for Asian languages?
That's right. Yeah, I started with Korean, and then that branched out into Japanese and Mandarin, and then a few Southeast Asian languages as well.
What's the difference between the Asian languages from the others? Why do you prefer them so much?
Mostly, I think my life just kind of turned out that way. I had a lot of Filipino and Korean friends in Dubai when we lived there, and then back in South Africa. My mom was an English teacher, and most of her students were Korean, so I was always surrounded by Koreans and Korean culture, so it just kind of came naturally. And the more I got into Korean culture and language, the more I realized the similarity to Japanese and how they both stem from Mandarin Chinese, or from Chinese at least. So uh, I guess it kind of just snowballed because they're from the same language family. And I'm quite interested in the culture and the music as well. So that provided a lot of motivation or reason to keep going.
And how do you organize your studies nowadays?
I wish I had time to study every language every day, but I have a very tiring full time job. So I don't always manage to make time for language learning. But um, given lack of resources in some languages, I've started taking lessons on italki. So maybe half an hour to 45 minutes talking to a teacher to get conversational practice in. But most of my language learning is passive. So listening to music, watching TV shows, sort of just picking it up here and there, which is not always the most effective way to learn a language because I need a lot more active learning. But given my full time job, I just can't afford to dedicate so much time as well.
You said something interesting about the most effective way to learn a language. According to you, what is this way?
Um, Not passive learning. So making sure you get active, comprehensible learning in. So making time to, if you hear a word, to write it down and to use it immediately, not just to let it go by. So actually putting in the time and through immersion as well. So usually what I say is the my main tip is whatever you do in your native language, try and do that in your target language. So if you usually write a diary, do it in that language. If you are listening to the radio, rather do it in your target language. So try and turn your whole life into the other language. So you can replace your daily activities in another language.
And in which languages do you normally speak during your daily routine nowadays?
Well, I hear Mandarin Chinese at work a lot because my colleagues are all Chinese. So usually when they talk to each other or on the phone, I hear Chinese. But at work, we just use English, and I speak Afrikaans to my parents, and I use Korean and Japanese on a daily basis to talk to friends and on social media. And then I'm actively focusing on Spanish and Tagalog these days.
You are focused in Spanish and Tagalog.
Yeah, I just started them, so trying to get them up from zero.
Okay, so first of all, about Afrikaans, it's a very important thing. You used to have a YouTube channel to teach Africans to people, that's correct?
Yes, I still do. I just don't update very regularly.
Ah, no, but it's still there, and you have this interest. So, in your head, when you're alone, in which language do you think? English, Afrikaans?
That's very difficult because you can either say that there's internal dialogue, which is where you speak to yourself, which has a language attached to it, or there is just thoughts. So a lot of people talk about, well, if babies don't know how to speak and vocalize, can they still think? Obviously, babies know how to think, but they're not thinking in a language, right? So I guess my thoughts don't have a language, but if I have internal dialogue, it depends on the situation. Sometimes it's English, sometimes it's Afrikaans. If I'm like fully immersed in Korean and I'm in Korea or in Japan, it's one of those. It fluctuates quite a lot.
I see. It's a very complex question.
Yes, yes.
And about Afrikaans, there is at least I believe that in South Africa, people used to speak different languages, besides English and Afrikaans.
I
Is that
still do. We have 11 official languages.
Yeah, but you feel that in your days, you use it to speak more than these languages?
Um, my office in South Africa was English. My university was trilingual, and pretty much the whole country can speak English. So English is actually the third most spoken language, but it's the most common. So numbers wise, third most spoken, but everybody can speak English as a first, second, or third language. And it also depends from area to area. Some areas have Zulu as a main language. Some areas, like in the south, Xhosa is the main language. So it really depends on the area. And I didn't really grow up in South Africa, so I get a lot of comments on YouTube saying, well, this girl is South African, but she doesn't speak South African languages. That's ridiculous. And that's quite offensive because they don't take time to understand that I didn't grow up there. I didn't have the opportunity to learn all the other African languages. And I mean, I'm already trying, and I don't see them trying with tons of other languages. So I think we just need to be respectful towards each other. We don't always have all the time in the world or all the resources to learn. So I think every effort to learn any language is beneficial.
I totally agree. Is that serious that you speak a bunch of languages and some people give you hate comments because you don't speak? Come on.
Yeah. They say, how can she call herself South African if she doesn't even speak one South African language? Which is untrue because Afrikaans is a South African language. It may have roots in Dutch, but it is an officially recognized national language.
And you spoke about being raised in South Africa, and you said you weren't. Where were
Yes,
you raised?
I grew up in sometime in France, and then 3.5 years in Pakistan, 5 years in Dubai, and on and off in Japan for 4 years.
That's impressive. And where do you feel home?
I don't. I think it's a very fluid concept. It changes constantly. So I write about that a lot on my blog, my Instagram, and I've done a few interviews as a TCK, a third culture kid. So if you're interested, you can just Google that. But the concept of home for me is very, very fluid. It's not one place permanently. I don't have a childhood home per se. For a long time, it was Japan when my parents were living there because my family and my church was in Japan. Right now it's Singapore because I'm here and I'm out of the house, like I'm taking care of myself. So Singapore is home. It changes depending on where I am.
Okay, that's a very good answer, and I can let the link below for the interview.
Thanks.
Okay, and about the Africans teaching, you were YouTube teaching Africans. Do you have experience like teaching? It's something that you like to do, teach people.
Yes. Yeah. I've been teaching for almost maybe 7 years now since I was in I think my second last year of high school. So maybe a bit more than 7 years. I don't know. Can't count. But so my mom was an English teacher and a lot of her students were Korean. And then when she moved to Japan, I took over from her. So I was teaching English to Korean people, which is how I started out. And then as I progressed in my languages by word of mouth, people at university would approach me and they said, "Oh, I hear you speak Korean. Would you be able to teach me?" Or, "Hey, somebody told me you speak Japanese. I'm actually looking for lessons." So kind of built up from word of mouth. And then I had quite a lot of students in South Africa. And then when I moved to Singapore, I changed that I am only teaching online on Skype.
I see. That's a question that I want to make. Why do you learn languages?
For communication, to better understand different cultures, to make new friends, to expand my worldview, to make it easier to travel, to keep myself entertained. I have a very short, not a short attention span, but I'm interested in lots of things and I need lots of stimulation. So learning a new language provides me with new movies to watch, new music to understand, new friends to talk to. So all of this input is really stimulating, and that's what I get from languages.
Makes sense. And you said that now you're focused on Spanish and Tagalog. Why those languages?
I've always heard Spanish around me, but I never wanted to learn it, and I was quite adamant on not adding it to my list because I was always pestered by Spanish people. Why don't you learn Spanish? Why don't you learn Spanish? It was kind of a bit of a rebellion, like, don't tell me what to do. But I've always enjoyed Spanish music. Like, there's no doubt to that. I've really, really always enjoyed the music. And my mom recently started learning Spanish, and she's extremely passionate about it. So I thought I'd join her so we can, share study tips. And the connection to Tagalog and Spanish is obviously a big one. Philippines used to be a Spanish colony, so I found that learning Spanish would be also beneficial for my Tagalog studies, and I've always wanted to learn Tagalog since 2005. So I just decided rather sooner than later.
Yeah, that's something that caught my attention here. You said that Tagalog will help Spanish, and a lot of people say that don't study two languages at the same time. How do you see this point about studying two languages at the same time?
I'm quite in the middle of the argument. Either it's good or it's bad, and I haven't defined the answer for me yet because if they are too similar, you can get confused. But in the case of something like Korean and Japanese, for instance, where they are pretty much identical in grammar and some vocabulary, actually more beneficial to learn the one to an intermediate or upper beginner level and then start with the other to guide yourself. So Korean and Japanese uses sentence particles like topic markers, object markers, subject markers, and these don't exist in English and Afrikaans. So after years of studying Korean and finally grasping the concept of what these topic and object markers really mean, when I started learning Japanese and they introduced that, I was immediately able to grasp, oh, okay, it's the same with Korean, and then continue. Instead of spending weeks trying to be like, when do you use this? What do you use it for? So in instances like those, learning two languages at the same time or using one to learn the other is really helpful. But I'm not far enough in my Spanish or Tagalog studies yet to be able to say whether I'm getting confused or whether it's actually helping or not. But if I do it in a different mindset, have a Tagalog mindset when I'm learning Tagalog, Spanish mindset when I'm learning Spanish, I'm pretty sure I'll be able to overcome that, hopefully.
I'm anxious for the update.
Thank you.
And could we say that your mom is your biggest influencer, or because you talk a lot about your mom?
My mom is my biggest source of motivation and inspiration because she's always encouraging me to go ahead and do things. So she's never told me, why are you learning so many languages, or why don't you learn that language, or just calm down and learn one. She's always said, wow, you're really doing what you enjoy and you're very passionate. Keep going, keep going. And she's also extremely curious about languages and very interested in different cultures. So it's really fun to bounce off ideas and share stories with her. So she is a source of motivation, yeah.
That's very interesting. And so can we say that this parent support is, I don't like to use this word, but like the key for what you do, for the key for your motivation?
I wouldn't say the key, but definitely a factor that keeps me going or that encourages me at least. And I've received many comments from people saying, my parents don't want me to learn this language even though I really want to. And I've always found that strange to understand. How can your parents tell you what to learn and what not to learn? Because, I mean, you have free time on your own to learn a language, but I think maybe these people are approaching it in the view of maybe buying lessons for their child. You don't always need to go for lessons to learn a language. I can understand if parents are saying, well, you need to focus on French at school, so I'm not going to give you Korean lessons, but you can learn it on your own. So it was always a foreign concept to me because my parents have always been very supportive. Not, I mean, financially. All of my languages are self-taught, but um, I think there are definitely ways around not buying lessons per se, if that's what parents are concerned about.
Uh, Something caught my attention again. You said all your languages are self-taught.
Except French at school and Arabic at school. So apart from those, the rest are self-taught.
Ah. So you believe that we don't need exactly to have classes to learn a language?
Absolutely. Those are beneficial. And I mean, you can look at classes from different ways. You can enroll in a university and get classes, or you can go to a academy in school and get classes from a teacher, or you can have a conversational partner on Skype or language partners. Obviously, you need this type of input from native speakers. So I guess the term self-taught can be interpreted wrong because what I mean by self-taught is all my resources are all of the studying is happening by me. I'm generating the content to learn this language, but I always need input from native speakers. So I will, translate my own sentences, but then I'll upload it to a website and have a native speaker translate it for me. Or I need conversational practice, so I'll call someone. So definitely input needs to come from native speakers.
Makes sense to me. Let's talk a little bit about the Asian languages, especially Chinese and Japanese and Korean. Um, Dealing with the tones,
Mm.
how can a foreigner do that?
Mm.
For
Luckily,
us,
Korean and Japanese don't have tones, but they do have specific intonations, like hashi and hashi in Japanese. The one is bridge, the one is chopstick. So you need to be careful where you place the emphasis. For Mandarin Chinese, you have a lot of tones. For Cantonese, even more. And Vietnamese also has lots of tones. What I found is the best is just listening to it as much instead of trying to focus on drawing the tones out or trying to visualize it and say it to yourself. You need to listen to it more. And I prefer listening to things in chunks because I have found that it's easier for me, which is made up of maybe 1, 2, or 3 Chinese characters. And then it becomes difficult to say the whole sentence when it's a whole bunch of different tones combined. And I've learned that that is a problem for me. So the best way now to go forward is to memorize entire sentences, not focus on the individual tones of each word and try and say that, but rather listen to the sound of the whole sentence as one and hear where the voice is going up and down, and thinking of the whole sentence as a chunk and trying to replicate those sounds.
and have you ever thought about Cantonese? Do you study it?
Before I took Mandarin seriously, I did start with Cantonese because one of my close friends was teaching me Cantonese, but it was just sort of dabbling in it. I do enjoy Cantonese music, and I think it's a very beautiful language, but as of now, I haven't had a lot of time to dedicate to it because I'd like to get my Mandarin fluent first.
Let's see. And do you think that these languages they help each other? Like you use your Korean to start a new Asian language, for example?
Yeah. A lot of my resources for Southeast Asian languages are written in Korean, just because the quality of the resources are quite high. Also, given geographically that Korea is close to a lot of other Asian countries, so I'd expect good resources from Korea, instead of trying to find some English resource for another language. So a lot of my language learning resources are written in Korean or Japanese to learn other languages. So yes, I have learned through other languages.
And how to deal with the writing system?
It does take time in the beginning, but for me, it's just a simple task of writing it over and over and over until you've memorized it, and not writing single characters too much. Obviously, learning the single characters in the beginning, but the best way is to learn by, because that way you are learning vocabulary at the same time that you are practicing the writing system.
I see, but which writing system do you consider is the hardest one between Chinese, Japanese, and Korean?
I guess people tend to say Japanese because it has 3 alphabets, but Japanese uses Chinese characters. So I guess what people get confused by is the kanji, or the Chinese characters. I wouldn't say it is extremely difficult once you know how it works. So left to right, top to bottom. If you know how radicals are written, those are like little pieces that build up a character. So if you look at one very complex character, you can see that, oh, it's made of, a person and a mouth and a roof and a piece of grass and a water. And all of those come together to form this new character. So looking at it from an outsider's perspective, if you haven't learned any Chinese, it does look extremely complicated, but it's actually just little puzzle pieces, really tiny building blocks that you put together to form a whole. So starting out from the basics really, really helps, instead of getting confused by more advanced characters.
And should a beginner start speaking from the beginning, or
I
learn
think
the
so.
characters first?
I think so. I don't see anything wrong with speaking from the beginning or using what you know already, so that people can start correcting you, or you can get used to using the language. That's how I started learning Chinese. I used the app called WeChat, and I found some Chinese-speaking people in my area in South Africa. And I could really pretty much only say ni hao and wo shi, like hello, I am. And that's all I could say. But the more I used it, the more I learned new things. So somebody always, like, I would talk to a whole bunch of different people, and the one person would, like, I would say, well, shi Lindie, I am Lindie, and then say that to 10 people, for example, and the one person would be like, oh, okay, I see, or the other one would be like, oh, nice to meet you, the other one would be like, oh, my name is XYZ. So by just saying one phrase to a bunch of different people, I get a whole bunch of different replies, which I was able to translate and put in my vocabulary to use further.
That's a very useful tip that you're giving. And
Mhm.
you said in the beginning that you are a designer, right?
Mhm.
And nowadays you work as a designer. That's correct?
Yes.
How do you divide your time between being a designer and a language learner?
Mm. In an ideal world, I wish that my job could incorporate more languages. Back in South Africa, when I worked as a UI UX designer, I was really happy the one time where I could use my limited Chinese to do research on a Chinese website that was a competitor for my brand. And here, for example, I'm doing a project for Hokkien, which is a major dialect here in Singapore with really rich culture and history connected to it. So I think coming from, if I hadn't known anything about the language or the culture, this project would have been a lot harder. But even though I don't speak Hokkien, I at least know what it is, what some words are, how it is different from Mandarin Chinese. So in that way, sometimes languages and design do overlap. I did work in Japan for a while. I did some internships there, and the company was completely in Japanese. So also in that way, I was able to combine my ability to speak Japanese with design work. But time-wise, working a full-time job here and then coming home extremely tired and not having energy to learn languages is a challenge. And I think just rest is really important. I wish that it could be I wish I could learn languages 24/7, but I do recognize that I need time to rest. And once I'm rested and once I do have time, then I feel more energy and motivation to sit down and study. But part of the reason I've started taking lessons on ice hockey from tutors is because sometimes I'm just way too tired to make my own resources and try and teach myself. So it's a lot easier to just have someone to guide me through, especially when it's a new language like Tagalog or Spanish. So kind of switching off my brain and having conversational interaction with someone is very helpful. It's a lot easier on my brain than it is to grab a textbook and try and translate stuff.
I see. And about those languages, which language do you consider that gives you more professional opportunities?
I don't know how to answer that because I've mostly worked in English environments. My Korean is more fluent than Japanese, but because my parents were living in Japan, I did my internships in Japan, even though it probably would have been easier to do it in Korea, language-wise. So I don't know yet. I'm hoping in the future I can get some jobs in those different countries. So we'll see.
Good answers to that. So you consider Korean is the most fluent language between them?
Yes, I've learned Korean the longest, maybe going on 10 years now.
Is Korean your favorite language now?
I can't say which one is my favorite language because I enjoy them all for different reasons. For the script, the sound, the grammar, my experiences. So I really, really cannot choose, but it's up there on the list, yeah.
I see. And what about your plans for the future about language learning?
Language learning, I'm hoping that my time in Singapore will help me improve my Mandarin. So I definitely want to become more fluent in that. And it is true that no matter how fluent you are now in a language, you will forget it over time if you don't use it. So I've lost a lot of my French, for example. But I don't want that happening with Korean and Japanese. So I'm actively trying to keep Korean and Japanese fluent. And then hopefully Tagalog and Spanish can become conversational.
And what about your project with Africans?
Right now, there's not a lot of traction from people. Like the people who want to learn Afrikaans, it's a very small market. And if I had a bit more time, I would like to expand my online arsenal of resources to teach people Afrikaans. But right now, there's just not enough demand to be able to motivate me to update it very regularly. So if I have time, I try to update it, yes. But I don't want to abandon the project at all.
I see. I'm anxious for this project too.
Thank you so much.
And I put the link below with about your Africans project too. And if I'm about to start a new language, for example, it could be Japanese, Chinese, let's say an Asian language, what would you advise me to do? How should I start that? I have no notion. Maybe I speak two languages, but no Asian language, and I'm about to start. It's a very completely different experience. How should I start?
If it's something very new and very different, most likely the sound will be something you need to get used to. So I would advise starting to listen to the language as much as you can. So music or radio or watching TV shows, even with English or your native language subtitles, just so you can get used to the sound, so that when you need to reproduce those sounds, you have sort of a history of, oh, I heard that before, that's how it is said. So you can sound more natural. Because having a good pronunciation can trick people into thinking you're more fluent than you actually are. If it has a script, I would recommend spending time to learn the script because I wouldn't really rely on romanization because of how there are so many different systems on how to romanize something and they can confound your pronunciation. They're not like, for example, in Spanish and Afrikaans, a J is read like an H. So if a Korean word is romanized with a J, which should be pronounced like the English J, maybe a native Afrikaans or Spanish people will pronounce that as H. So it's not good to rely on romanization because your native language will influence how you read the romanization. So rather try and learn the alphabet first, because then you'll know what a character or what letter sounds like so that you can reproduce it better.
Good tip. Makes total sense to me. And do you have a favorite material that you like to use for self-learning, for example?
Strangely enough, I love using apps to call people because, like I said earlier, sometimes my brain just needs to switch off and I don't have the mental energy to sit down and actually study. I love books and textbooks and notebooks though. But apart from that, I like using, there's quite a lot of apps out there where you can phone people. So language exchange apps like Tandem or Hello Talk or Hi Native or recently an app that's been gaining popularity is called Good Night. It's mostly used in Taiwan, Korea, Taiwan and Korea, sometimes Japan. So it's just nice to phone someone. You don't need to, like, you can't see their face, it's just hearing their voice and you can just practice speaking. So just, it helps me learn new words in context, helps me improve my pronunciation, and gives me speaking practice. So I like to use phone apps.
Okay, and well, there are a lot of questions that I want to make, but unfortunately, I think we don't have time for that. I could be here for 2 or 3 days making you questions because it's very priceless, you know, all these insights that you're giving. But unfortunately, we need to end that. But I hope in the future we can make an interview, maybe in Spanish. Like you're focused in Spanish now, so it could be a possibility. Let's say.
One day, yes. Thank you so much for having me. And if you have any other questions or if anybody who's watching or listening, more than welcome to contact me through my website. There's a contact form there which goes straight to my email. A lot of people contact me through Instagram, and it's quite difficult for me to reply on my phone because I have sweaty hands, so it's hard to type. But if I'm on my laptop and email, I'm more than happy to answer any questions there.
Okay, thank you for being here. Thank you so much. I hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much for having me.